I first met Tim in 1965 when he rode on the footplate with my regular driver, Stan Harms, and myself whilst we were working the 6:09 p.m. passenger train from Waterloo to Woking. I remember that we had an original West Country class locomotive that day, and unusually, the coal hopper at 9 Elms had emptied some hard black Yorkshire coal onto our tender. Opening the firehold door when exiting Clapham Junction, the fire was burning so fiercely the gabardine mac that Tim was wearing started to smoulder, and I thought he was going to burst into flames. Following our first meeting, I always found him kind and considerate, and he knew everyone on first name terms. After leaving the railway in 1994, I lost touch with Tim, but after returning to the railway industry in 2005, I met him again at railway reunions, especially when I joined him to celebrate his 80th birthday on the Bluebell Railway, when he was invited to drive a special train from Sheffield Park to Horsted Keynes. I thought it only proper to include some extracts from Tim's career on the railway, starting from his initial interest when riding on a light railway to Courtmacsherry with his parents when he was 4 years old, to him becoming a fireman, driver, traction inspector and train crew manager at Woking until his retirement in 1989. The following stories are extracts from his varied career on the railways. Tim's first sight of a steam engine was an 060 when he was a small boy aged 4. His parents had taken him to the picturesque seaside village of Courtmacsherry in County Cork on the train. Tim was completely fascinated by the locomotives which weren't numbered but had names: Slaney, St Molliger and Argadine, and instead of playing on the beach, he would be up at the station looking at the engines. Unfortunately, the railway closed for passenger traffic in 1947 and has now become a walkway and cycle path. Courtmacsherry Station circa 1946. Most of the passengers are attending a local regatta. The Timoleagan Courtmacsherry branch was latterly operated by the CBSCR and featured a section of Ireland's only standard gauge tramway running alongside the R601 road between the two villages. Regular passenger service on the branch ceased in 1947, but it remained in use for regular goods, sugar beet and excursion traffic until complete closure of the West Cork lines in March 1961. Today, the small wooden station building at Courtmacsherry remains, as does part of the single platform. The former loco shed also remains in use as a boathouse, and the nearby pier, constructed for fish traffic in 1893, still survives. Later on, Tim tried to get a job on the footplate in Ireland, but his father was dead against it and wanted him to get a job in the commercial side of things. Tim went to various technical colleges for a couple of years and tried a commercial job for a year, but he just wasn't interested. At the age of 21, Tim decided to go across to England to try for a job on the railways there, and found that there weren't any, but instead was given a job to work in the coal mines at Nuneaton. Tim wasn't classed as a Bevin boy. Young British men conscripted to work in the coal mines from 1943 to 1948. However, he did this job for 2 years. After meeting his two cousins who lived in Bedford, who both had jobs on the railway, again he tried for a position in the loco, but found there just weren't any, but there was a job going on the permanent way. Tim stuck at this for 2 years, then thought that perhaps there might be a position in the motive power department elsewhere, and if there was, he would be able to transfer there. Tim had a colleague at Ashford in Kent and found that he was able to transfer there as an engine cleaner. As it turned out, Tim didn't do much cleaning as they were badly in need of firemen, so he was thrown in the deep end, so to speak, and became a fireman. Tim remembers that some of the locomotives he worked on at that time were nicknamed Germans. These were the 440L1 class, designed by Richard Baltall. Tim didn't stay at Ashford for too long and put in for a transfer to 9 Elms. He was told by his work colleagues that he must be mad to want to work in such a dirty, filthy place. The Ashman men thought upon themselves to be the kings, and remembers walking along the road together with one of these drivers one day and embarrassing himself, and perhaps him, when he saw a young lady walking along the pavement on the other side of the road wearing long trousers. Tim casually remarked that he thought she would look much nicer if she was wearing a skirt instead of trousers, and as they walked by, the girl said to Tim's driver, "Hello, Dad." Very embarrassing. Also at that time there was a small band attached to the depot, and Tim used to play the fiddle for them. Not the Irish jigs and reels, Tim added, but proper music. Anyway, Tim's appointment came through fairly quickly, as there was a huge vacancy list at 9 Elms, chiefly because it was the Festival of Britain in 1951. Tim started off in the tank gang, and his first driver was Georgie Lloyd, who had only just passed out as a driver. And soon after that, Tim moved up a link with driver Jack Wicks and then driver Bert Full. As Tim progressed through the links, he joined the pilot link with driver Len Rickard and spent all of the rest of his firing career with him until it was time for him to join the top link with driver Charlie Happy Gordon, whom he fired to for odd days, but not as his regular fireman. Charlie used to sell horse nails that were used to shoe horses, and these were utilised to remove corks from big ends, and he sold them for a penny each. One notable trip Tim had when he was a fireman was one Christmas Eve, and he and his driver had to relieve the mail train at Basingstoke. Tim said to his wife that he hoped to be home early for Christmas Day, but that depended on whether the train was running right time and whether they'd managed to be released from Waterloo to take the engine to 9 Elms depot and dispose of the locomotive. They made their way to Basingstoke and relieved the mail train crew, but when they climbed aboard, the fire was down and out. It was about the time when the coal that had been supplied to various depots was absolute rubbish. Mostly dust, and what lumps of coal there were didn't burn well and created clinker that ran through the fire bars and stopped any primary air from getting through. Looking back, it was absolutely hopeless. However, they managed to reach Waterloo eventually, some 20 minutes late. To top it all, after they'd disposed of their locomotive, they were then asked to dispose of a couple of tank locomotives, as they had time to spare. So much for an early day. By this time, Tim had reached the required age to pass for driving himself, and was passed out by Inspector Reg Pemberton. Tim already had a good knowledge of the rules, as he was a secretary of the MIC, the Mutual Improvement class at that time. After passing the rules, his practical exam consisted of working the 10:54 AM passenger service from Waterloo to Basingstoke with an S15 class locomotive. The photograph shows S15 class number 30825 with a similar train to the one that Tim worked on his driver's practical exam. It is seen here passing West Weybridge Station on the 11th of July 1953. The station was renamed Byfleet and Newhaw in June 1962. Note the array of electro-pneumatic signals. It wasn't long after that Tim decided to apply for a position as a driver in the dual link. He got his promotion to driver, and it gave him the opportunity to come back onto the steam as well. John Barrett, who came up from Dover to 9 Elms at the same time as him, was taking the firing school classes, and when John transferred to the training school, Tim took his place. He was also on the panel of acting running foreman at 9 Elms. However, this was usually covering the shifts which no one else liked doing. During this time, Tim was also appointed as a running foreman at Feltham, although he never actually went there. Tim had read so many books that said the job was dirty, grimy and filthy, but Tim didn't think so. He took pride in what he was doing. With Len Rickard, for instance, their overalls would be as clean on the Friday as they were on the Monday, and although they didn't have the same locomotive every day, whenever possible, the running foreman did try to let Len have West Country class number 34007, Wadebridge, as that's where Len had been born. A lot of other drivers that were at 9 Elms had also transferred from the West Country. They always made sure that they handed over the locomotive to another crew better than it was prepared for themselves. On one occasion when Tim had finished duty and was going home, he caught the 6:09 p.m. train from Waterloo to Woking and made himself comfortable in the brake van behind the locomotive, reading the paper. They left Waterloo on time, and after going through Clapham Junction and down through the cutting towards Earlsfield, it sounded as if the driver was working the engine as if he had equal to 100 wagons behind him. The train got slower and slower, and Tim looked at the vacuum brake gauge beside him in the brake van and thought, something's wrong here. They went through Wimbledon at walking pace and eventually came to a stand on the down-through platform at New Malden. Tim thought he'd best find out what was wrong and made his way to the cab of the locomotive to find out what on earth was happening. Tim looked in the cab and saw the driver, and the fireman was sitting in the driver's seat and appeared to have been doing the driving. Tim asked the fireman to nip up the box and tell the signalman they were down and out, and also tell him that as soon as they'd got enough puff, they would clear the down through to the down local. This he did, and as soon as he got back, Tim instructed the fireman to get the dart down and give the fire, if that's what you could call it, a lift. Tim really didn't think they would be able to move anywhere, as the fire was nearly blacked out. Anyway, between them, they managed to get some heat into the fire, and as soon as they got enough steam to move, they cleared the down through. Tim then decided to do the driving himself and really worked the engine hard to liven up the fire. At Hampton Court Junction, the fireman went to pick up the shovel again to add more coal. Tim stopped him, and by the time they got to Woking, the engine was now showing the white feather without having to touch the fire again. All that was needed was to just put the injector on and cut it as fine as possible. Much later on, after Tim retired, he met the driver, and the driver said to Tim, "Do you remember that time on the 6:09? And Tim replied he'd never forget it. One of the many trips that Tim went on as a traction inspector was a very sad occasion for many, as it was to be one of the last passenger trains to be worked over the Somerset and Dorset line, the S&D as it was called. This one was the Somerset and Dorset Farewell Tour, organised by the LCGB Locomotive Club of Great Britain, and ran on Saturday the 5th of March 1966, 2 days before the line's closure. The line from Bath to Bournemouth was a scenic route which took in many market towns on its way, and also crossed the Mendip Hills. In its heyday, the line saw an impressive number of different varieties of locomotives and rolling stock, particularly in the summer months, conveying holidaymakers to and from Bournemouth. This included the famous Pines Express, which started its journey south from Manchester. The leg of the journey that Tim was the inspector was from Bath Green Park to Bournemouth, and the train was headed by 2 bullied light Pacifics, West Country class number 34006 Bude and Battle of Britain class number 34057 Biggin Hill, and for Tim's part he rode on the train engine number 34057. It was characteristic to the extent that it was so sad for drivers who had spent their life within the motive power department. They were given redundancy and just chucked aside. It wasn't so bad for the firemen, as most of the young men were able to find jobs elsewhere. At the age of 38, 1963 to 1964, Tim was firing on locomotives from Waterloo to Bournemouth and return, and remembers that they had an influx of firemen from Polmadie in Scotland. They hadn't had any experience at all, and had never been on a steam engine in their lives, and only worked on diesels. These men were put straight into the links and were given very little tuition. It was Tim's job to ride with them. One turn they worked in number 3 link was the 8:35 AM Bournemouth and the 1:05 PM return, and they also had the Tavy, where they worked a fully fitted freight train from 9 Elms goods yard to Salisbury. After getting relief at Salisbury, they would then walk down to the depot, prepare the locomotive and return working with the 2:05 PM Stone train to Woking. Tim remembers he was the inspector on a Royal once from Bournemouth, which was going to Liverpool. One of the Royal Princesses was on the train and the locomotive was a brush type 4. Usually the sliding windows on the driver's and second-man side were very stiff, but on this occasion Tim went to slide the window shut and it came up with such ease he didn't get his fingers out of the way in time and trapped his fingers between the window and the frame. It made a bit of a mess of his finger, which was bleeding, but luckily the driver had a first aid kit. Tim also did some firing on the V2 class locomotives when the Merchant Navy class locomotives were all withdrawn following an incident at Crowley. On the 24th of April 1953, the middle axle of Merchant Navy class number 21C20, Bibby line, broke whilst approaching the station at speed. Part of the platform was demolished, but thankfully no one was hurt in the incident. But this led to all 30 Merchant Navy class locomotives being withdrawn from service while the accident was investigated. Further investigations showed that there was a common fault on the locomotives, making the axles susceptible to metal fatigue, which led to the redesign and replacement of the crank axle. When Tim first started working as an acting inspector, they were all based at Woking, because that's where the control was at the time. They then moved offices to Waterloo Road, Wimbledon, and Stan Downs was the superintendent. When steam ended in 1967, Tim was transferred back to Woking as an area inspector, and when Roy Vigers retired as depot manager at Woking, he was asked to cover the job. Tim did this for 12 months, but didn't particularly like being office bound and would rather be out with the men. However, Tim did eventually take the job full time, but decided to take early retirement in 1989 at the age of 64. Tim kept in touch with some of his railway friends by joining the Old Southeronians Association, a group that meet at Woking Railway Club every first Wednesday in the month. Some years later, he happened to meet Jim Lester at Bert Hooker's funeral, and they got chatting and realised they hadn't seen so-and-so, etc., and said what a good idea it would be to have a Nine Elms reunion. The first year they had to finance the whole thing themselves, but then it became a real success. Here are some more photographs of Tim's 80th birthday surprise at the Nine Elms reunion held at the Bluebell Railway on the 21st of April 2005, where firstly the Inspector Crowley Express headboard is unveiled. It's then time for Tim's work colleagues from depots around the southern region to congratulate him on his 80th birthday, and for him to board the footplate and drive the locomotive from Sheffield Park to Horsted Keynes station. As mentioned earlier, the Nine Elms reunions at the Bluebell Railway were a huge success, and the next set of photographs from years 2006 to 2009 capture the camaraderie that exists within the railway industry. Tim also visited the Mid-Hants Railway with railway colleagues in 2007, where he was reunited with a locomotive that he worked on quite a number of times whilst working at Nine Elms MPD, original West Country class number 34007 Wadebridge. In 2010, Tim and some of his old work colleagues had a day trip to Weymouth and return, the train being hauled by rebuilt Merchant Navy class number 35028 Clan Line, and a great time was had by all. In this photograph, taken en route at Yeovil Junction, Jim Lester proudly holds the new 9 Elms engineman headboard, which was displayed on the front of number 35028 Clan Line on the return trip from Weymouth to Waterloo. Rebuilt Merchant Navy class number 35028 Clan Line is seen here at Yeovil Junction, having been prepared for a return trip from Weymouth to Waterloo. Tim poses in front of number 35028 Clan Line at Weymouth Station prior to departure. Tim offers a bit of friendly advice to the fireman. Number 35028 Clan Line is photographed here at Eastleigh on the return trip. In April 2015, on behalf of the 9 Elms Reunion Committee, a 90th birthday celebration was held for Tim at the Woking Railway Club. Following a short presentation which followed Tim's career of his working life, Tim celebrated his 90th birthday with his friends and work colleagues.